Welcome to the podcast, Courtney, Katy, and Deanna. Great to have you all.
Hey.
Hey.
Right on. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge I'm producing this podcast on the stolen lands of the Kalam and Clayhoos, Comox, and Local First Nation, one nation where we settlers came in and separated them into reserves. Grateful to be here. So yeah, let's start by just getting some introductions. Katy, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
So my name is Katy Leigh-Osroosh. I am currently an assistant professor at the University at Buffalo, here in Buffalo, New York, which resides on Haudenosaunee territories. And I have been at UB. This is my second year. And prior to this, I was at San Diego State for 3 years, where I was the co-PI on a grant that trained school psychologists and school counseling graduate students to work with Indigenous students. And I do not identify as Indigenous, I identify as biracial. But growing up here in the Western New York area, in Haudenosaunee territory, I, was privileged enough to grow up knowing the history of the land and also getting to know the community and the people. And I have kind of made it a mission of mine in the work that I do to give back to my communities, and I include the Indigenous community within that, since they were, pivotal in my own identity development as a biracial individual. And so currently my work, I am trying to get more partnerships with community organizations here in the area, including the Seneca Nation, and really involve the graduate students here at UB with working with Indigenous students and understanding Indigenous context and laws. And this is Deanna. You can hear her. So this is baby Deanna. She is about 3 months old. And so this is a new role for me. And I'm currently learning how to balance being an academic and a parent, and doing so in a nuanced way, a decolonial way, abolitionist way, I guess. So we shall see. But thank you for having me. I really enjoy being here.
Yeah, so my name is Courtney Copeland, and I am a graduate student at University at Buffalo, a doctoral candidate currently. I also am a enrolled Seneca Nation member. I identify as Black and Seneca, Turtle Clan. I am originally from Buffalo. I spent about 15 years, though, living in Greensboro, North Carolina, where I did a lot of community work, was president on Native organization boards, as well as worked as a school counselor for a number of years at a Title I school. I am also the host of Diagnosing Sitcoms and Movies podcast that is available wherever else you get podcasts.
Right on, right on. And so, Courtney, tell me a little bit about, I'd like to learn just a little bit about kind of the Seneca Nation. So kind of where is it located and kind of what's sort of, some of your kind of history with that nation.
Mm-hmm. So we are located in Western New York. We are part of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Nation, and we are the keepers of the Western Door. So we are the tribe that was located the furthest west of the collection of tribes that make up Haudenosaunee Nation. And so we currently have two reservations. There's one in Allegheny County and one in Cattaraugus County. And then have lots of members that reside outside of the reservation as well, within the cities and local areas surrounding that. We have about roughly 8,000 enrolled members, and then countless numbers of descendants as well. It's matrilineal society, and so it goes down your mother's line. And so which is why there's enrolled members and descendants. But in addition to that, we have our own functioning government. And yeah, what else would you like to know?
Gosh, so much, but it might be saved for a different episode. I had someone on recently who was from the Tonawanda tribe. Is that? And she was saying she was telling me a little bit about Seneca. It's the first time I ever kind of heard anything about it. And she was saying that there's kind of her tribe, which is kind of small and tiny, and then there's sort of the larger Seneca Nation. Are you kind of in the larger one? Is that how
Yes.
that works?
Yes. And so they are kind of functioning separately, but still under the umbrella of Seneca. So all
Mm,
still Seneca people, acknowledged as Seneca people, but functioning under different governing bodies almost.
yeah. And for you, was were you like always sort of involved and connected to your culture, or was that something you kind of connected to later? Or because I know a lot, I've heard from a lot of folks that seems, especially kind of folks that are kind of a younger generation, that it was sort of a later in life connection for a lot of folks.
My mother thought that it was very important for me to be knowledgeable about my culture. So, as a
Mm,
child, I grew up as a Black child, but
mm,
I also attended Native American programming, so after school community center programming, things like that. So, always very included in the community.
mm,
Unfortunately, Seneca Nation is not exempt to anti-Black racism, so it was something that I kind of separated myself from for a little
mm,
bit, or because I identified as Black first, and
mm,
so then later on, connecting with the communities in North Carolina really helped a lot, serve as a form of healing for me, and
yeah.
so. With reconnecting down there, it really brought it all together. So when I came back and started my doctoral program here in Buffalo, really connected to the community here and did a lot of work in the city of Buffalo because there
Mm,
are a lot of uh we have a large population within the city of Buffalo, and some of the thinking is less closed-minded in the city as it is, say, on
mm,
territory. And
mm,
so making sure that all of the natives that are within the city of Buffalo have places where they feel supported, connected, can continue to learn their culture as well. But I have learned a whole lot more as an adult than I did as a child. Yes.
gotcha. Cool, cool. And can you tell me why you decided to go into school counseling?
Well, I am a graduate of Cheektowaga High School, and they had an internship program. In your senior year, you could do like some intern position, and I thought I wanted to go into human resources, and then I
Mm,
did it for like 3 weeks, and I was like, yeah, no, this is terrible. I hate this. I don't like this at all. And so then went to the counseling center in my high school and had conversations with our school counselor, our school psychologist, and really got a lot of guidance from them. And they said, well,
mm,
why don't you just kind of shift your internship and start working in here? And so then from senior year of high school, I kind of knew that working in the helping profession was definitely something that I wanted to do. And then I graduated with a master's in clinical mental health, but still knew that I really appreciated the level of prevention that's involved with school counseling. And so I went and did the extra year to get a dual master's degree in school counseling as well, and then started that way.
If you're collecting behavior analyst continuing education credits, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is Seneca.
and so what about you, Katie? How did you get into counseling, or why did you get into counseling?
Yeah, so mine's a little bit of a unique trip a little bit. So I wanted to be veterinarian. I wanted to go into specifically large animal sciences, so working on
Mm,
farms.
wow.
Um, I, this area in Western New York is kind of a mix of urban and rural,
Mm,
and so I had exposure to kind of both, and I liked both. I liked being in a city, but I also like getting out in the country, and I didn't want to be in an office, and I like
mhm,
working with my hands. And so my undergraduate degree is actually in animal sciences. I have a bachelor's of science in animal science.
mm, wow.
Yep, learned how to raise cattle and sheep and all that fun stuff in undergrad. But unfortunately, being a biracial individual, going into agriculture has its barriers. And, I faced that quite a bit in undergrad where, there's a lot of exclusion. And then about my junior year, I got to a place where I really felt as though no matter what I did, I wasn't going to be enough. I wasn't going to be valued. My work wasn't going to be valued. My expertise wasn't going to be valued. And unfortunately, that's, and it wasn't enough. And I was also a Gates Millennium Scholar. And so I was fortunate to have been given this gift of free education. And, during that time, getting a lot of messaging of like, okay, we're giving you this gift, do something with it. And I've always loved service.
Right.
I've appreciated service. And so I kind of really examined what I was doing, and I'm like, okay, I don't fit. I'm not appreciated. And am I really doing enough? Am I really giving my fullest in terms of impact back to the communities? I know I could do more. And so what does that look like? And I've always appreciated counseling. I've always liked human services fields, but I just didn't see myself. I wasn't as confident in seeing myself in that role. But I picked up a minor and loved it. Absolutely loved it. Found that I really fit within those classes and those discussions and learning more about myself. And so I decided that this is what I was going to do. Unfortunately, I didn't have any experience listed in work experience working with humans. So I spent a year as an assistant daycare teacher at a YWCA, and to just get that experience, right? And applied to different programs and got into actually UB's program here in their school counseling master's program. When I got here, I didn't feel like it was enough. I felt like there was a lot that I could be further pushed and developed, and I felt like I wasn't getting enough. And so fortunately, I had a really good professor who looked at me and said, you need to be in a PhD program, which I had never had been in my, field of vision before. Like I'm like, I don't see myself going that far. Like I want to be a practitioner. And so long story short, there was a opportunity to go to New York City. They had a cultural institute that was a week long that invited different colleges and programs to come and do basically an immersion, going around in the different boroughs, seeing different community centers, talking to different populations. And so I participated in that the summer after my first year of my master's program, met a group from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And the leader of that group, the assistant professor at the time, Brian Hutchison, had really good conversations with him, connected with him, and he ended up encouraging me to apply. And I applied and got in, and he was my advisor for 5 years. And I have a PhD in counselor education and supervision. So here in the States, as you know, there's a separation between counseling psych and counseling, which, historically it's been back and forth. There's really not much of delineation between the two other than the training. But even there's a lot of similarities. But my degree program specifically trains us to be faculty and to be supervisors for the most part. And so I'm not a licensed psychologist. I have my certification in school counseling. I could get my license in clinical mental health, but I've bounced around so many different states that I haven't done that yet. But I'm enjoying my time, though. I really didn't see myself being a faculty. I wanted to be a practitioner. I wanted to be a school counselor and maybe teach as an adjunct. Was a school counselor for 2 years and realized again with impact, I could do more. So here I am as an academic. And I really enjoyed, finding nuanced pathways to do work and work directly with community. And it's really tough as an academic because I really would prefer you to stay in the ivory tower. But that's been my mission is to stay connected. So I came back to Buffalo for that purpose to give back to the community here during my time here. So.
Gotcha. And so you said that the program is geared towards training folks to be faculty or supervisors?
Yes. So counselor education and supervision is basically the PhD for clinical mental health and school counseling. And so the courses are specific to similar in some ways to counseling psych. We have research classes, we have clinical classes, but it's mostly geared to prepare folks to be in the academy as faculty and or supervisors, whether in districts or as, clinical supervisors of like your own practice as a clinical mental health professional or mental health clinician, depending on the state.
So you don't really train like practitioners then?
We do. So the PhD, so our terminal degrees are at the master's level in counseling, which is what differentiated it from counseling psych for a long time historically. That's changing now. APA is actually coming out with a master's terminal master's degree for counseling psych. I know that's in the works, but largely what delineated the two professions was that in counseling, the terminal degree is a master's, and so you can be a fully licensed practitioner with your master's. Whereas counseling psych, PhD was always looked at as the terminal degree, as like if you want to be a practitioner or you want to be a psychologist, you have to go through with your PhD. Which I know is different from school counsel or school psychology, because school psychology, they do have a terminal master's degree where you just need your master's and you can practice. Though there are some programs like San Diego State's program, which is I think the only EDD program in school psychology. So yeah, a lot of terminology. It's more politics than anything else here in the States. But yes. So counselor education and supervision predominantly trains practitioners to become supervisors or academics in the field.
And supervisors, what do supervisors do? Are they supervising students that are trying to get the credential, or are they like
right? Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So with the terminal master's degree, you still need at least like 3,000 hours of supervised clinical experience in order to be fully licensed. And so to be supervisor, you have to go through training, and there is the certification process. Typically, it's a certain amount of years of experience, depending on the state, plus some, a few credits or courses. But some folks do prefer to go just straight through with a PhD and pick up those hours and the classes in that way. And so I have colleagues from St. Louis who graduated with their PhD, started their own practice, and they primarily work with practitioners at that level where they, bring them in and they have so many interns each year and they train them and then they get their license and then they branch out. They're basically becoming a franchised business, which is pretty cool. So they train the practitioner then can create their own practice based on that model, and then it goes on from there. So from a school counseling perspective, we actually have a lack of school counseling specific faculty in counselor education and supervision, because the majority of folks who have the specialty in school counseling decide to work within school districts because the pay is better. And the benefits typically are better, and they don't have the constraints of in the academy where you're pressured to publish, and there's not as much value placed on the practitioner end of it or even teaching in some respects. And so from a school counseling specialty, you'll see a lot of folks with a PhD or even EDD staying within school districts, becoming like a district lead in student support services, working at that level as a supervisor.
So many terms. So a counselor educator doesn't necessarily mean school counseling.
Correct. It can mean we train clinical mental health, school counseling, and even voc rehab. There are some programs that specialize in voc rehabilitation as well.
And then I don't know the difference at all. So counseling psych, so what do counseling psychologists do besides be PhDs and be registered psychologists, I guess? They just get more money?
That, and they also have the ability to conduct assessments. And so there is a much larger focus on being able to deliver and score and interpret and provide results from assessments as well.
And would there be counseling psychologists? Because I think we're mostly talking about education and maybe schools to a lesser degree today. Would counseling psychologists be in schools?
Not as much. I mean, there could be if they wanted to, and sometimes there are some schools and some districts that are partnering with agencies or outside providers to deliver actual mental health counseling services within the school systems and in the school districts, and they may call on someone who may be a counseling psychologist. But for the most part, it would be either a school psychologist or a school counselor, or of course, just social workers and things like that.
Yeah. And is it pretty common because I'm in Canada, right? So I've got a totally different context. Is it pretty common for schools to have both the school counselors and the school psychs?
Yes, because the school psychologists are the one who are at doing testing and things like that for special education, for different accommodations and things of that nature, whereas the school counselors are more on the day-to-day focus, running small groups, providing interventions, prevention, curriculum, things of that nature as
Mm.
well.
And do they generally get along?
I loved my school psych. We
Yeah.
worked very closely together, and
Mm.
especially too when you have multi-tiered systems of support as well. You oftentimes work collaboratively as a team to make sure that
Mhm.
students are receiving interventions, that there is a path where they are being tested for further things. Then you work very closely with your school psych. So
Mhm.
the dream is yes, there might be somewhere where y'all just don't like each other. That's
Yeah,
something,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but as a function in your role in the school system, you usually work hand in hand with those other
Yeah.
individuals in the building.
Because by trade, I'm a behavior analyst, and we don't get along with people very well, generally speaking. I mean, I think part of it is because a lot of schools don't have us as in-house,
Mhm.
employees. We're often external coming in, and so, like, who's this guy coming in? But also, historically, I think it's gotten better, but and I've said this in a lot of episodes. Generally speaking, we don't play well in the sandbox. We don't collaborate with anybody because we're behavior analysts, and so everything's behavior. So therefore, we can do everything because it's all behavior, and so we can do it all. There are a lot. I think there are a lot of folks that still believe that we can sort of deal with it all, and so we deal with a lot of things around sort of competence and scope and all that kind of stuff. And it's historically it's gotten us into trouble, and it's been really kind of poor marketing kind of on our part in a lot of ways. So it's nice to know that you folks are getting along, generally speaking, unless it's just a personal connection that doesn't work out.
Yeah, generally speaking, I think again historically there's been like some as school counseling and school psych have had to fight for funding and fight for their positions. Sometimes the
Mm,
associations have, I think, depending on leadership, right, kind of bolstered this identity as the separatist, right, where we
mm,
are so unique. We are, that for some folks in some districts, there is this barrier where, school counselors are only privy to so much of the information. And, at this stage, when a student's referred, it goes all the way over to a school psychologist and they have no involvement in the process. And so that I think is more from probably a few decades ago, and some folks still kind of follow that model. And unfortunately, there is still in some areas that separation. But what
mm,
I tell my students and what I've done, similar to Courtney, like when I was a school counselor in St. Louis, like I'm like, nope, that isn't how we're going to do this. Like we are
mm,
using multi-tiered systems to support. We are an integrated system. There is a reason why the social worker, the nurse, the psychologist, and the counselor all have this designation as school before it, right? Because we have this unique perspective as from a preventionist
mm,
standpoint, that and this privilege of being within a system where we have access to the population, where private practitioners, and as you've seen and in your role as well, right, you come into the school from an outside organization, you're given a list
mm,
of students,
mm,
and you may not have access to their full file or their full record or history, whereas in our roles within the schools, we have access to that information. Students can show up at our door and we don't need to have go through HIPAA for consent, to
mm.
talk with that student, right?
Yeah.
Um, and we can get into whole like differentiation with like laws and stuff like that. But I think it is important for school counselors and school psychs to really work together. And that's why when I was working at San Diego State with the grant that we had, it was an interdisciplinary grant for that purpose. So we trained both school psychs and school counseling students. And so they had no courses together outside of the seminar that we had for that grant. But during that process, right, they got to bring in all that knowledge they were getting from their other courses and then talk about that within the context of how do you support Indigenous students. Um, So it's really important, I think, from a training perspective, that, there is in some way an integration across disciplines, whether it's school social work and school counseling, school psych, even speech pathologists, behaviorists, as you mentioned, right? So that students are aware of how their roles actually align and how they should work together.
And I should disclaim that there are a lot of behavior analysts that are good people and do want to work with others, but um, historically, I think we haven't been all that great. Have you folks had experience working with behavior analysts in the school?
I
I
haven't.
No.
I have a couple friends who work as behavior analysts in school
Yeah.
systems,
Yeah.
especially in California.
Yeah.
But I do not have just in the states that I have been, in the districts that I've been. It's
Yeah.
not something that we have had a lot of direct collaboration with. And I also think that it probably results from the school system not being conducive to the type of nature that the interventions and things that you guys do. School system is set up for like little factory workers as opposed to the betterment of children here in the United States. I don't know if it's the same in Canada, but that kind of also might be why there is some of that contention between the as well, because if everyone is working towards the same goal, but if you're coming at it from different perspectives that don't align with just the school system's kind of structure of things, I can see how that's hard to kind of navigate an individual.
Yeah. So you're working on your doctorate. What's the focus of your studies?
Nothing to do with school at all.
Okay.
I've kind of moved into more sports psychology, which is something that I originally developed from being in the school system as well and working with the individual athletes in the middle school level. And so it was something that first introduced to it at that level and kind of has grown since then.
So you're studying sports psychology?
So I'm studying counseling psychology, and I am focusing more of my studies towards sports psychology specifically because there are a lot of programs currently that are focused primarily just specifically on sports psychology, but that is continuing to grow as the years go as well. So I am more so counseling psychology because I do want the overall generalist umbrella to be able to provide supports and interventions for all different kinds of individuals, but also seeking more specialization in sports. So right now, my dissertation is on masculinity and African American male football athletes.
Cool. And so, what's sort of your hope, sort of post doctorate? Where do you want to be? What do you want to be doing?
So there's short-term goals, there's long-term goals.
Yeah.
So right away, the short-term would just be to work at a Division I university as a sports psychologist.
Okay. All right.
So still connected to education in some way with it being in the university counseling umbrella, but just a different position.
Gotcha. And then long-term?
Long-term, I would like to open up my own community agency.
Okay. That focuses on sports psychology? Or
no, that just focuses on providing services and providing support to individuals and communities of color.
Okay, right on, awesome. And what about you, Katy? What you're obviously doing the work right now. What's the focus of your research?
Who do you want to be when you grow up, Katy?
Yeah, that's still a question I go over. I look at it as in chapters, right? My motto is the slow professor. This is my 6th year as a faculty, and typically folks are transitioning into tenure. But I, really want to engage in work that is using community participatory models, which requires time in building those relationships. And currently, I'm on the board of a community 501c3, so a community agency here, organization that focuses on supporting parents, specifically parents on the east side of Buffalo, which is predominantly Black community. And they are working on partnering with the school districts here to provide almost like a parent mentoring program, with the hopes that by supporting parents, that would also then help, right, and trickle down to the students and their success within education. And so I'm building relationships with them through my role as a board member, and hope to support their work and have that evolve into some joint projects. And so that's that's I think the privilege and the difficulty with community-based participatory work is that, as a researcher, the questions don't generate from me. They generate from the community. And so sometimes it takes time and a lot of capacity building, which I really enjoy. But, I would say in academia, they don't enjoy so much. They'd much rather you do research and not so much like program evaluation and capacity building. But outside of that, I'm also, branching out and hope to do some work with the Seneca Nation at the Community Center in Buffalo. And I'm partnering with the YWCA of Jamestown. They have a racial literacy program that we just got a seed grant through transitional studies at UB, a small one, but a great one, to help them build their program out. So they're using racial literacy to support students within the rural setting, to have more exposure to different communities, and also then help with their own self-worth and feelings of belongingness within the school. So I love those types of projects. Other than that, I write. And so I just hope in the future I'll continue to build upon this work and then continue on as a faculty, I guess. If not, become a practitioner again. That's the benefit of being a school counselor. I can just go back into school counseling if I wanted to.
Yeah. What do you mean by racial literacy? What's that?
Yeah. So racial literacy, I haven't brought my notes on that. It's a whole field of study. But it's let's see if I can summarize this right. Maybe Courtney, you might actually know more about than I do in terms of the literature. But in summary, it's essentially ways in which you expose children to then think critically about their self, their race, specifically racial literacy, right? Their race, their identity within the social context and institutions in which they live. And so the literacy piece, I think, sometimes throws people off because they think just like books and reading. But it's more about the literacy piece is knowledge, right? And learning cognitive growth in that area and being able to really think critically about who you are and what does that mean to you. And some racial literacy programs do put it within the context of books and exposure and, showing students, right, different ways in which being Black looks. And within Western New York, that's really important because we have predominantly low socioeconomic status. This is a very disenfranchised area. This is an area that is very, was one of the old industrial areas like Detroit, where industry left, factories left, and everybody just kind of stays and percolates. So you have a lot of intergenerational poverty here. And in some ways, it can be difficult for people to see what it looks like outside of that, right? And so racial literacy here could also mean looking at, what does it mean to be Black and middle class? What does it mean to be, in these different roles in terms of career development? And Blackness doesn't just mean living on the East Side and being impoverished, right? So yeah, racial literacy is multidimensional. I would say that there's there's more, I think, scholarship about it within like the learning sciences. I know here at UB, we have our learning sciences department, which is really engaged in it. With the seed grant, I'm working with someone who has a background in literacy education.
So it's not just it's not just teaching people of different racial backgrounds how to read. It's
correct.
It's about teaching folks how to learn about their specific cultures and identities and sort of that piece. And I suppose with literacy isn't just about learning to read. Like some of these folks you're working with probably can read. It's just teaching them, it's teaching them about culture and context and identity and whatnot.
Right. And I mean, even for myself, someone who's biracial, but appears white and, was raised by my white family. My racial literacy was pretty narrow, and it was actually exposure to Seneca Nation members, through school and different community programs that actually helped my own racial literacy, even though it wasn't my community, but it really posed questions that allowed me to explore and just kind of to see like, oh, this is what makes me unique. This is why
Mm.
I think differently than the other kids here. And so, yeah, it's beyond just learning how to read. But again, it's really like when you read, right, you're taking in text, but then there's these other cognitive steps, right, and
Yeah.
processing and taking it in and making it critical sense of it and meaning out of it. And so when you're not exposed a lot to different ways of being Black or different ways of being Indigenous, your literacy about what it means, right, can
Mm.
be really confined. And so through racial literacy and exposing folks and immersing them into different ways of being, and within their community with themselves, it allows them to then have different ways of critically thinking about themselves and what they want to
Mm.
do and where they want to go and who they want to be. And with the community as well, right? Where they see themselves and where they want to be and have that picture in mind.
Mm.
Because in the Seneca Nation, they do in some ways racial literacy for Seneca Nation and the other the Six Nations here. Looks like the language programs, right? Looks like having the summer camps, um, exposing the youth, taking them to
But
college trips.
like the cultural camps and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right on. And what kind of work? Because you mentioned before we hit record that you two write together. So what are you working on together?
Yes, I can start with that. So Courtney and I actually are both members of the Native American Concerns Group within the American or Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development, which is under ACA, which is American
Okay.
Counseling Association. So anyways, we're part of this group, this niche group, and
Yeah.
her and I met during COVID, actually, one of the virtual meetings, and connected. We didn't know each other before, but we were both from the same area, so we're like, hey,
Yeah.
and yeah, we well, I think we first did a webinar, right?
Yep, it started
Yeah.
saying like, hey, if there's any if you guys are interested in us kind of leading presentation, looking at specific issues focused on school counselors and how school counselors can assist us Indigenous students in their role, what that looks like, just kind of some best practices. It started with that and leading with that with the webinar, and then we presented that for the Association of Holistic Counseling.
Humanistic. Yep.
Humanistic counseling. Lots of letters.
Yeah, right.
And I knew it was an H. And so presented that and then continued to do work and writing together as well.
Right on.
Presented at ACA.
Yeah, we presented at ACA last year. So our manuscript is focused on what does recognition look like within the field of counseling for Indigenous peoples, because there's a missing piece within our work, both as practitioners and from a training and education perspective. Something similar to APA and similar gap, right? We talk about all these different identities and populations, but when it comes to Indigenous populations, there's very little said because very few people know very much about Indigenous populations within the United States, right? And so as school counselors, this is a critical gap because we are faced with every sort of student. It's not just students who can afford to come see us, in private practice, but we are faced with every student. And specifically with Indigenous students, there are laws and things that we need to have knowledge of in our roles in order to ethically support them and do the work correctly, and ensuring that the sovereignty of the nation is upheld and supported, and the identities of the students as well are upheld and supported. And so we know this gap exists, but there's very little in our textbooks. There's no requirements on our licensure exams, ethics exams, our accreditation. There's nothing mentioned about knowing the different laws or even historical context, Indigenous contexts that are essential in competently supporting Indigenous peoples and students. So our work, our manuscript is a little bit of history. So it kind of reads a little bit like a book chapter, but we also then provide recommendations to the field as to what they need to do action-wise to correct this, to really take steps in correcting this issue.
Which is important too, because like Dr. Katy said, we serve all students. And I think a lot of times, because here in the US, Indigenous populations make up about 1% of the population, that there isn't even really a real focus. And a lot of times, sometimes school counselors don't even know who the Native students are in their buildings. And so
Right.
they don't know how they are could be either not serving them to the capacity of which there are laws that protect them that say that they should be delivering services to them, as well as they might not be doing, but might not be knowing what level of disservice they might be doing to those children as well. And so
Mm.
it is just very important to not only highlight those gaps, but then, okay, well, what are the next steps? What are the things that can be done? How can we move forward so that we are not contributing to the erasure of our historical context, our moving forward, ourselves in the future, but we're adding to and we're contributing in our professional role in that way.
So what are some of the gaps that you found?
Yeah, I think, for starters, I always find it ironic how we get on movements, right? And I don't know what the definitions are of some of those terms that we use. And so decolonial is a term that has become popular here in the United States.
Has it
I
ever?
know
Yeah.
it's popular in Canada, but in Canada, you all went through, actually some policy work there. So
Y'all are kind of doing the work.
people
No.
have a better understanding, I think, a little bit of what it means, right? Land back and
Yeah.
um,
I will just quickly say we started to
okay.
do some policy work, but we had a bunch of recommendations too. But I saw a paper recently, 8 years later. I think there was something like 93 recommendations that were made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and well, it's eight of them maybe have been followed through with. So yeah, it's a big piece of paper right now that people seem to have stopped reading for some, but that's for another time. Yeah.
Fair. The states
Yeah.
doesn't have a commission yet, so
Mm.
There are no
Right.
papers.
Yeah.
And so
no
when
one's
it comes
thinking
to
about it yet.
no. And so we have a lot of scholars, good intentioned, right, that are doing a lot of work that they're naming as decolonial. But if you were to ask them, what's the history of the indigenous populations that, where you reside currently or where you grew up, they would struggle to say that. When you ask them to define sovereignty and what that means, they wouldn't know that. I know students, they kind of look at me puzzled, like, what does it mean? Like that they're sovereign nations. What's the difference between a federal designated state, or a state recognized, tribal organization or an unrecognized tribal organization? Like, what are the differences? And, what does that mean for the citizens, right? The students there. Some people don't know that the difference in terms of identity. They think of Indigenous as a racial category when it's actually more of like a citizenship category. It's not a racial category or simply like an ethnic category. But to be Indigenous means being a citizen of a sovereign nation, or akin to it, right? Kinship. And so that's a big one, right? So we're putting all of these terms of decolonialism. But when you ask folks, what does it mean? What are some Indigenous folks that you've worked with? They can't answer that, right? They don't know. And so with the work that I've been doing with Courtney and what we're trying to do is just start off even just from the basics. Like, here's a history. People can say boarding school, but they don't know that, like, here in West New York, there was a few boarding schools that were here. They think they were far and often away. There is, stereotypes here about the Seneca Nation being so rich and so corrupt. And some of that, by those biases coming through without an understanding of, again, sovereignty, right? Like how their government structure works, why there's a difference between the Tonawanda Senecas and the Seneca Nation out in Salamanca. And so those contexts are important. And so in our manuscript, we really just try to lay it out like, here are some of the main federal laws and policies that are important for you to know as a practitioner that have impacts for today. And, and then in terms of recommendations, like, we need to have this in our training. We need to have these laws put in our exams. So students are aware. And that's before even getting to having an understanding of Indigenous knowledge systems,
Mm,
which is a whole
yeah.
other, right, a whole other scope of work and practice that folks need to get into.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't know, Courtney, did I miss any?
Not really. I
Emphasizing.
don't feel like missing any. I think it's just how specific, like just looking at even ethically, and how having knowledge of how tribal communities work, and considerations of ethics. And when you're thinking about that, when you're thinking through ethical dilemmas, are you taking into account how the community functions and how tribal communities work in that way? What is the knowledge that is present in ICWA? And so when there are things of children or students being either put in placements or whatever that looks like for that individual student, what is everyone's understanding of those laws and the historical implications that influence those as well? And so why it is important for you to not only know that, but then function as an advocate in your professional role as well for that individual, so you're not perpetuating historical trauma. Just all of those different things and looking at how we in our role can contribute to betterment.
And you mentioned laws a few times. So whose laws are you talking about? The laws of those nations? Is that the idea? Or
Actually, they're
Federal
federal.
and state.
Mm-hmm. So ICWA, so Indian Child Welfare Act.
okay.
So in that law, it essentially basically states that if a child is like in a school setting, right? So you hear a case of suspected abuse, and you make a call to Child Protective Services. If the child is a citizen, is Indigenous, they are protected under ICWA, meaning that the child cannot just be simply removed from the home and placed with anybody. That nation needs to be contacted. There needs to be a community liaison part of that process to place the child, ensure that the child is placed first with family, and if can't be placed with family, is placed within the tribal nation, and if can't be placed with the tribal nation, is placed with a family who identifies as a citizen from another tribal nation. And this was in response to the boarding schools and the removal of children.
Sure.
And trying to guarantee that that doesn't happen, right? That these adoptions outside of the community in these nations doesn't take place, that children aren't stolen. And so, that's an issue, especially from a school counseling standpoint, because we're one of the ones that are mandated reporters, and we make those calls. And so if we don't have knowledge of the student being Indigenous, or the family being Native, even if the student is, not a citizen, is a citizen, right? That's not for us to decide. But we need to have that understanding, because there are protections for that student. From a state level and federal level, so we have ESSA, which is Every Student Succeeds Act, which is essentially our new standards for education. And with that comes federal funding. And within the states, they have Title VI, which is specifically to support programming that's culturally relevant. And that extends beyond just Indigenous students. But in the case of Indigenous students, that Title VI funding is earmarked for them. And the nation is a part of that process in deciding how that funding is used, or should be a part of that process in deciding how that funding is used and what supports are needed. And as a practitioner, I didn't participate in that process, but Courtney, I know you did. So you probably have more insight on what that process looks like.
And so when I was out, because I served as president of the the Native American Education Board for Guilford County. And again, lots of letters. I have to remember what each acronym is.
Yeah.
But so basically there is federal funds that are allotted per student. And so each student has to fill out a form, just kind of letting a formal form of, this student is Indigenous, they belong of this tribe, they reside within this school district, and that kind of follows them through. And then that is what then qualifies them for the funding that is received for that individual school district. And so the school district then has the board that that meets and decides on how to provide supports and what they want supports to look like going forward for those individual students. And so whether that be culture classes is something that some districts do, if that is having them pulled out to pay and paying for an indigenous teacher that comes in, teach cultural relevant lessons within the school systems. And there are some where it is they bought laptops, and so that students have access to technology and they can rent it out for the academic year, or that there just might be supplies that are provided to individual students so that no student that identifies as indigenous is going without each semester, and what that looks like going forward as well. And then also providing as an advocate for indigenous students as well, because there has been data that shows that indigenous students are being, especially females, are being suspended at higher rates and things of that nature as well. And so providing as an advocate and almost like a liaison between the community and the parents, the students, and the school system as well.
Wow, right on. Are these relatively new laws? Like, these sound like some good ones, sort of.
They're good when they're followed.
And so what happens when they're not? Because it sounds like the point here is that a lot of folks, at least in sort of in counseling realm, aren't familiar with this stuff, and that's kind of what your paper was about, is about sort of noticing what folks know about and don't know about, and then some recommendations. So if you have a counselor or an educator or whatever that's not following the laws and sort of just, you know, treating the you know, maybe the indigenous child like any other child, or whatever, what happens? Like, so if they don't sort of follow it, does anything?
As far as like consequences? Oh yeah, no, there are none. Real short and simple to that one. It's that if there isn't any attention being paid to it, that's just what it is. There isn't any attention being paid to it. And so then the harm is continuously being done, and the erasure is continuing to be done, and the distrust grows between a historically already a testy situation between public education and indigenous communities. And so it's our role, and part of the passion behind the research is wanting that harm to lessen. Not just being less harmful, but being helpful. So making sure that individuals are aware of the different things that exist out there for their students, making sure that they are first even aware of the indigenous students that are within their buildings, in their district, they are, what tribes that they represent, and who those communities are, and and knowing where you can get additional information on the in your area as well, are all things that are very easy to do for as an individual working within the school system, but are the starting line of where you should be starting to do that work, if it's not already something that you are incorporating in the work that you do within the school system.
So how do you do those things? How do you find out if kids are indigenous or not, and what tribes they're in, and all that kind of stuff?
And so it should be, as if you are a school employee, it should be something that is included in your student data. And so if you are, whether it's PowerSchool or whatever electronic system, it should be something that is reported, whether or not they check Native American, and then you can look and see if those individuals have that specified Title VI form that is completed. And then also having relationships with your students, having relationships with your communities, having relationships with the parents in your building, and knowing and making sure that voices are heard and all ethnicities are celebrated in your building, because there have been some students who have been told, oh, well, you didn't look Native, so I didn't think that you were, and so we didn't include you in this, whatever the things are. And that's not how you identify indigeneity. Like,
right. By how they look. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and so making sure that when those things are coming up, that when students say, my mom said that I was whatever, you follow up. You say, hey, we have this program that is available to these students. Do you, by chance, is anyone in your role enrolled in your family? Do you know the history? Can you trace any lineage, so that in the event that you are, that we can get them connected with these services? And if you are just looking up what's available in your area, that's a Google search. If you could find a good restaurant on a Friday night, you can find what community is in your area, and what they have going, and what those things are, and just being involved.
Yeah.
And I think, too, like, one of the things that we say in our paper, right, is like, okay, too often competency is seen as like, oh, I know everything about this culture, I know everything about that culture. I can really empathize with their experience. And I think, something that I've had in conversation with other Indigenous practitioners and psychologists, because one had asked me, she had shared like a TikTok, and it was of this woman who was talking about how basically she is, now on the spiritual like quest, right? Where she like has this attachment, basically in the animism aspect of Indigenous knowledge systems, right? Where this acknowledgement of beings outside of just the human form, the non-human, and the non-human in some ways taking priority to the human aspects of being. And so there's this white woman who is, espousing all of these, things about being so connected to the land and having this understanding and notion. And my friend who's she's studying to be a school psychologist in Canada. And I can't recall which First Nations tribe she's a part of, but she asked, she's like, well, what's your perspective on this? She's like, because this really bothers me, this really irks me. And I said, as someone who's non-Indigenous but has been a part of, Society of Indian Psychologists as an ally member, and, has tried in some ways to participate in different, aspects of community and understanding and relationships. I know that I can never fully know everything, right? Like I know that being raised from a Western Eurocentric perspective, that when it comes to Indigenous knowledge systems, I don't have access to that because that's not something I can just learn. That's a whole form of being. And I think too often people think about Indigenous knowledge systems in the same context as religion, where it's not. Like I can study to be a Catholic. I can know everything that it is to know from the Bible, one ways, frontwards and backwards, and participate in rituals and, identify as a Catholic and be a Catholic. But just like, Judaism in a way, right? Like there's a lineage there. There's more than just the religion. In fact, a lot of people who identify as Jewish don't actually practice Judaism. They identify as atheist. And so in a similar context, and there's other Indigenous nations too, specifically in the Middle East, that have that as well, right? Like there's a religion that they may practice at this time, but indigeneity is a whole different perspective. Indigenous knowledge systems for that group and that community are practiced in their whole other way. And so there has to be that acknowledgement. And so you can know a lot as a non-Indigenous person. Like I can learn about the context of Indigenous peoples, of sovereignty of the nations. I can know facts. I can learn some of their experiences and have a better understanding of how to approach and best supporting students and/or community members. But I need to know that there is that barrier. There are things that I will never know. I'm still very mindful of which ceremonies I participate in, even if I'm invited to. Like smudging is one where at the grant, this was the discussion that we had towards the later part of my time there at San Diego State, because they started the seminar with smudging. And this was something that early on, oh, Deanna's awake. This is something that early on in the program, they started doing. The students wanted to participate in that, right? They wanted to start the session like ceremony. But as a non-Indigenous person, and there being other students in our program that were non-Native, I'm like, I don't know if that's right for me to participate. So that just I think in our recommendations, we need to be very mindful of that when working with non-Indigenous folks, right? That you need to know these things to support students, and you also need to know there's a lot that you will never know. And that participating in a sweat lodge does not make you an expert. Sorry, I'm gonna mute.
Yeah, no worries. And what were some of the other kind of recommendations that you're making to the folks?
And so we kind of broke them down on different levels and looked at what specific, what counselor education and research can kind of do, what clinical approach is, and what organizational and institutions can kind of do. And so with looking at the formal, like we said before, formal task force being developed by that include Indigenous people and individuals who have experience working in Indigenous communities. And so that, because we have the example of the Society of Indian Psychology Ethics and their commentary on the ACA ethical code and what that looks like. We have that example that can be furthered. And so looking at if there are current and basically interrogations of certifications, this is for cultural bias, looking at there is exclusion in context of the different testing procedures, the different licensure procedures, the different policies and procedures that are currently in place, just making sure that those are equitable, and then allocating resources to also support the retention of Indigenous clinicians from
Mm,
throughout those programs so that we can continue to see more of us in those spaces. Just admitting uh, individuals into hurtful environments is not supporting them. That's not
mhm.
encouraging their enroll. You have to support them while they're there as
Right,
well.
right.
And so then also from the other perspective of making sure that there are certificate programs that are maybe at institutions or in different certification bodies that look at and creating those certificate programs that incorporate and train clinicians in research methodologies that have Indigenous background or Indigenous ways of knowing, so that there is some level of competency that is being done without just saying, so, oh, I learned all of the things, I can lead it now. But no,
Mm,
having actual training in those different things. And then also making sure that there are laws that making sure that the laws that are in place currently aren't impacting our lived experience and
mm,
how we approach ethics and how we approach navigating those difficult situations as well, making sure that individuals are aware of, not just aware of the laws, but also aware how they influence the lived experience of Indigenous people. And then requiring some knowledge of, like Dr. Katy was saying before, some people don't know what sovereignty is. It's important. There's some places where there's some basic things that should
mm,
just kind of be known. And then
mm,
like how with if we look at more clinical application, looking at making sure that the assessments that we use, that that they are proficient in cultural context, that they have some level of functioning within tribal sovereignty. They're not inhibiting that in any way through the with things that we're in the tools that we're using in intervention and assessment as well. And then knowledge of the community where you practice, where you grew up,
mm,
where you're from, where you're
mm,
working, that community. It's important that counselors working in tribal agencies know the laws and the oversight of the agency's operations.
yep.
School counselors need to understand the role that they ensure in the Native American youth that they might be working with, and so that they can also make sure that those individual students have access to those federal and tribal nation resources that are available to them, so that
Mm,
they can, and also both clinical and school need to just have an understanding of how to collaborate, how to effectively collaborate with the
mm,
community as around them, not just requesting them to come in in November to do a little performance for the children, but no, actual collaboration and what that looks like in meeting
mm,
as well as giving and receiving and being reciprocal in that nature. And
mm,
just if you are incorporating in some way some Indigenous practices or Indigenous ways of knowing, that you have training in it, or that you are bringing in Indigenous individuals to lead healing ceremonies and not just trying
mm.
to conduct something off of a video that you saw on YouTube or things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
But making sure that you are doing things with you're treating the individual and the culture with the respect that it deserves.
yeah, yeah. You mentioned sovereignty a few times as something folks don't know what that means. So, what does that mean?
Go ahead, Katy.
I don't know if I'm the person to fully, yeah, I guess
You
so.
have good definitions though.
Yeah,
From a
yeah.
definition standpoint, right? Because this is a topic, again, within communities, this is something that is continuously talked about and discussed.
Mm,
What does it mean to have this autonomy? And so within a federal standpoint, sovereignty within the United States, if you're a federally recognized Indigenous nation, means that you have your own government, you have your own, you have your own government. And so there are policies and laws that you can create within the nation and the community, that aren't interfered with from, the state, specifically the states.
mhm,
Um, there are, protections when it comes to, again, like some of the processes like with ICWA. And so if a youth is removed from the family, the tribe, it has to be, contacted first. They have to be notified and they have to be included in the process. Some schools, they have like something unique here in, which is a unique example of sovereignty, but something unique about the Seneca Nation out in Salamanca is that they are a nation that actually are on their territory, so they're never removed from their territory. And the town that exists within their territory, Salamanca, is actually leased from the nation. So they retain the territory outside
Awesome.
of the Kinzu Dam, which has its own history. But that's something unique. And something in terms of sovereignty as well, like, right, being able to say, you don't have to pay state tax when it comes to gas and alcohol and cigarettes and other items as well when you're on the reservation. And that's something that's been hotly contested with the state of New York for decades.
Sure.
And so just recognition that they are their own nation, they are their own entity, they have their own government, there are specific privileges that they have based on that standing and that sovereignty. And it's going to vary depending on the state, sometimes what those privileges look like. Where it becomes an issue sometimes is when it comes to like our murdered and missing Indigenous women, right? Where the police don't follow up. Why? Because they don't have jurisdiction on sovereign land. And so it's only from a federal standpoint that, the federal government will come in and provide support in investigations. But from a local standpoint, it's within the nation. And if it's someone outside of the nation, then it's less likely to be followed up on or even, gone through with. And so that is a barrier. Sometimes that has arisen because of the designation of sovereignty. And I think that's more just the U.S. government's way of kind of like, than anything else.
I get it. Yeah, for sure.
Which is why there's a push.
You want to be autonomous, then we won't help you.
Right.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. And then there's the state recognized, which doesn't have the federal designation and privilege, but they, so they don't have access to the amount of like funds, that federally recognized tribes would. State recognized tribes aren't protected under ICWA, but some states do extend ICWA to their state recognized tribes. And then you have tribes who are unrecognized, and those are hotly contested within the communities as well as, within, as to whether or not they're actual tribes or if these are people who are claiming to be that may not actually have ancestral lineage or kinship. So that's sovereignty in a nutshell. But again, this is something that, right, is contested within communities, and especially when it comes to citizenship, which is why, too, we say in our paper that all this, but as a clinician, it's not for you to decide who is Native and who is not. So it is to that community, and you need to recognize that and also have knowledge of the fact that you may have someone who, in terms of blood quantum, so the percentage of Native identity may be, let's say, 75%, but is not an enrolled citizen, depending on the lineage, right, in terms of designation for citizenship. And then you may have a student who is like maybe 15, who is an enrolled citizen. And that poses, that's important to know, right? Because when working with students, when it comes to identity development, that's going to be something that may come up for them, right? In terms of their identity and what does that mean? What does it mean to be Native when I'm enrolled, but I don't look at, I may not have an understanding as much about the traditions of the language, but then, my cousin over here, grew up on the res, has, a higher percentage, knows the ceremonies and rituals, but isn't an enrolled citizen. So.
Yeah, there's so many bits and pieces there. Just one thing you touched on there that I've heard referenced a few times now, but I haven't really had anyone explain it to me beyond that it's sketchy and racist, is blood quantum. What does that mean, and how is it even determined?
It's basically the percentage of Native that you are, kind of broken down simply. And so if we were to look at just my background, my mother is half Native and half Black, and my dad is Black. However, her mother is full Seneca. So her mother being full Seneca makes her eligible to be an enrolled Seneca member, which makes her children eligible to be enrolled Seneca members. But
Okay.
technically, I'm only 25% Native American, if you
Mm.
want to look at it that way. And so there, like you said, some of the practices are sketchy and racist. So some of that is to look at not almost like erasure of your indigeneity. And so, oh, well,
Mm.
if there's a certain cutoff as to where then you're not considered Native, then you're no longer a part of that community because
Got
it's
it.
far removed from your ancestry for it to count for you.
Mm.
Or it could also potentially be communities that are indigenous wanting to keep their members, their enrolled community from
Mm.
having children with people who are non-native, because then that lessens the blood quantum,
Mm.
makes them less than in some way.
Gotcha.
So it's all, yeah, it's just sketchy and racist, like you said, but
So and it's
I'll
and
make
it, and it's not actually measuring physical blood. It's just sort of, we look at your lineage and go, okay, they were full, they weren't, they were part, and then to do some really bad math and go, you're this percentage. It's not
I
like
was gonna say
it's not like Ancestry and Me where they do a blood test and go, oh,
not
well,
yet,
mm,
but some of the issues right now that are coming up are folks who have had grew up, let's say grew up white and had no connection with
mhm,
community, knew nothing about what it meant to be Native, but then they
yes,
do Ancestry and Me or 23andMe, and
I'm
I've got
7%.
I've got that
yeah,
7% or 2%, right? There's a really great
yeah.
South Park episode about this. But I digress.
I'm gonna find it.
And so those folks, right, are now claiming indigeneity and want to be enrolled, and that is
Right.
something that is, bringing up a lot for folks, right? Because like,
Yeah.
okay, you kind of have this right of return, so to speak, but what does that mean? Since you have no understanding of the culture, weren't raised by it.
Hmm.
It wasn't as if you were someone who was necessarily stolen, like you weren't a child of someone who was taken and removed,
No.
but maybe someone who just chose, you know,
The second secret word is blood.
later on, or it just got to the point where maybe that 2% is doesn't have as much meaning. You're not as connected.
Hmm.
And so,
Hmm.
what does it mean to be Indigenous? And there was a whole series of webinars last year. One of the speakers was Jacqueline Keller, who's infamous about looking at academics specifically who are pretendians.
Yes.
And so she was part of the talk, and there was also quite a few other academics. Kim Tallbear was another
Right.
who led these discussions about really diving into what does it mean to be Indigenous, and really diving into like kinship, right? And like kind of again with citizenship and with lineage and family and
Hmm.
ancestry, how there's this notion of kinship and it's more than just blood.
Mm.
And how different nations define kinship, what that means to them, because it's going to change depending on the nation. And really coming back to that practice of, okay, this is what it means for us to be in community. This is what it means to be kin. This is a way to kind of push back on pretendianism, and also this idea of blood quantum, which, as you said, is racist. Is the opposite of the one drop rule for
Hmm.
blackness, right? One drop rule being if you're one drop black, it could be 5%. Back in the day, not so much right now, but certainly a few decades ago, you were automatically black.
Mm.
Um,
Wow.
and that was to increase the number of black folks, to increase the number of folks that you could have in labor, right? Um,
Mm.
and you can keep down, whereas
Wow.
the blood quantum does the opposite, because it's trying to erase, because we don't want a whole bunch of citizens and sovereign nations rising up against the tide, right? We
Right.
we want to
Right.
we want to whittle that out. So yeah,
Well,
so it's,
there's a
it's
whole other area now I want to learn about. I've never heard of the one drop thing, so that sounds gosh darn horrible, and just a bunch of folks that just to essentially make more slaves or whatnot.
Mhm.
It sounds like what sort of the goal here was. And so these were probably folks that probably didn't even identify as black that are now being sort of categorized. So they, I
Mhm.
mean, I'm making a lot of guesses here because I don't know anything
No,
about
because
this.
it is something, now we're talking about race, right? Just
Yeah,
again, the United States is its own can of worms.
yeah.
But like, for me, for instance, right? Like people look at me and they may question a little bit. For the most part, though, especially white folks, folks of color, typically they look at me and they know that I'm something. I'm not just white.
Mm,
That I'm something.
yep,
They may not pinpoint me as biracial, but they're like, oh, you're something. White
yep.
folks typically look at me like, oh, you're white.
Mm-hmm,
And so I'm privileged in a way I can choose in some ways, right? What I identify or how I identify,
mm-hmm,
where my ancestors not too long ago wouldn't be able to. And so that one drop rule has kind of evolved and changed in some ways. And there's conversations within the Black community about that, right? Like,
mm,
what does it mean to be Black? Because how it's been defined is just in opposition to being white. But there's
mm-hmm,
more to being Black than just not being white.
mm-hmm,
And so what does kinship look like for us? What is, our history and our, like, what does it mean? What does it mean to be Black?
mm,
Um, so yeah, so it's yeah,
mm.
complex.
Interesting.
Yeah, for sure. You've talked a lot about erasure, and I think that kind of can circle back to sort of maybe the original reason why I reached out to you was around this your paper on cultural identity silencing. I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what that is and why you decided to look at it.
Yeah, so I'll do my best to tackle over Deanna here.
No worries.
In her swing. So my dissertation, I really wanted to have a better understanding of the schooling experience of Indigenous folks. And so, as someone who is biracial, something that I experienced was, microaggressions, macroaggressions that would really then, have me questioning, who am I?
Mm,
Because if again, right, going back to the idea of Blackness, like if Blackness is just opposition to being white, what does that mean for me? Because I can
mm,
identify as Black, but I'm white looking. I
right,
was raised
right,
by a
right.
white family, but I also identify with a lot of, my Black, my ancestors, and that,
Sure.
and the histories and what it means. I have, been under and received, you know, uh, microaggressions, macroaggressions, forms of oppression, structural racism. And so I wanted to have an understanding of what it meant for Indigenous folks when they're going through education, specifically
Hmm.
because of the history with boarding schools.
Yeah,
And I knew the stigmas growing up here with how people would talk about, the res kids in Salamanca or Salamanca School District. Um, and so that was my goal. And it was a very meaningful study. I spoke with 8 individuals who were from different nations across this continent.
mm,
It was a phenomenological study. It was a qualitative study. Really what came out of it was this identity development
mm,
where they did face, the silencing, and much of it came through absence in curriculum. Much of it came
yeah,
through, this absence of even people acknowledging that they were Indigenous. Reminders of the boarding schools. Driving by the boarding school where my grandmother was, and she's
sure.
sitting right next to me in the car.
Yeah.
Um, and so what I learned from them was, as a youth, right, starting off really strong, and I'm Native, this is who I am, no questioning of it. And then as they got into school, this starting this
Mm,
exposure of like, okay, well, I'm Native, but like nothing here is telling me or validating it or reminding me
mm,
and saying that I should be proud to be Native. So receiving those microaggressions and macroaggressions, and then starting that questioning. Well, what does it mean here? What does it mean to be Native? Does it mean I'm participating in these ceremonies? Does it mean that I'm, living on the reservation? Does it mean that, what does it mean?
mm-hmm,
Um, and so this identity development, this evolution going up through school, to where really what kind of happened for these individuals specifically was, um, when they started college, actually, they had experiences that really validated their indigeneity.
mm,
And a few of them had actually gotten to the point where they didn't want to participate. They didn't want to participate in ceremony. They didn't want to participate in, language classes. They
mm,
were kind of putting up this wall, right? Because they had been hurt too much. And so it was to the point where I don't want to engage with who I am, because I need to, in order to survive, in order to stay on this track, I can't, walking between worlds is too much. And so when I started college, um, many of them had opportunities like in Indigenous student associations or departments, Indigenous studies departments, where they took a class. Maybe it was just a language class. Or, complete wraparound programs like Syracuse University has one with their Indigenous Studies program, which is wrapped into their student services, which is, they have a whole dorm wing that is just for their Native students, where they have their counselors, they have academic support, they do things together. And it was really to support them, right? To encourage them to continue in higher ed, and also in some ways, right, to tell them that you can be Native, and, be someone who's in higher education. You can be Native, and that looks different for you. It could be that you are participating in ceremony on the weekends, when you're able to attend powwow or your social dances, and then you're back in school. Or, for you, it could be that you're not participating in ceremony, but you're wanting to do something. And this was common across all 8 folks, right? The desire to give back. And so all of them had this desire to give back to their communities, whether it was returning to their communities. I think for some it differed. And some of that goes back to opportunity, especially if you're in the Southwest or even here. There's not a lot of opportunities. And so you may have the desire to give back, but then, okay, what does that look like? How do you do that in return to your community, while also making sure that you're moving a step up, right? That's always that difficult balance, I think, for us, even for myself. That's something I go through. It's like, okay, I'm back, but I'm a completely different person. I want to give back to my community, but I also don't want to get trapped in a way, right? I don't want to get back into this cycle, because all of this that my family has prepared me for, my ancestors prepared me for, is to get out of the cycle of suffering, to get out of the oppression, right? And that is tough. And that is something that, these 8 individuals had shared as well, right? Again, desire to give back, but also this concern about like, okay, how do you balance those 2 worlds while also getting ahead, right? Like, how do you do that? So ultimately, cultural identity silencing is this process of survivance. So Gerald Weisner has this term, survivance, where it's kind of this resistance towards, right? This colonialism. And so, yes, they did kind of ebb and tide, where they start off really like with a strong identity, and then had gone through school, and it was really, ostracized and pushed and kind of forced down. But then as they grew into late adolescence and into especially college, they had opportunities that really allowed them to come back to that, and to really say, no, I want to do this. This is who I am. This is who I am moving forward. Now, what that means for folks who don't transition to the higher ed, I don't know. That's another study, right? Folks that end up going into trade schools even, or folks that end up staying in the res and graduating high school or not graduating high school. But something that I found was fascinating was when I presented on that study at the National Indian Education Association Convention, NAEA. There's a young woman, she was probably in her early teens, that approached me afterwards, and she was talking to me, and she said, this sticks out to me because my sister, she had an older sister, and she said, my sister's not wanting to do anything Native. Like, she's not wanting to participate in ceremony anymore. She doesn't want to join us in dances. She doesn't want to, like, she's completely like rejecting us and moving away. And when I'm listening to you, my question for you is, do you think that she'll come back? Because you said, that some people tend to, as they get older, they tend to want to come back to the community or embrace their cultural, aspects more. And do you think she'll come back? Which for me, I'm standing here, I'm not Native. I don't know this, this girl, I don't know her family or the dynamics or anything, but it really brought home for me, right, the importance of that, of folks hearing those experiences of those 8 individuals, right, and being able to share their knowledge with these folks, was that it gave, I think, folks a little bit of hope. This young lady was looking at this and going, okay, maybe my sister will come back, so to speak. right?
Yeah.
Or rejoin us when we're doing ceremony and participating. So
Mm.
that was the kind of the crux of the
Yeah.
study.
One
But
thing I really liked about the study was when you then asked everybody how their experience was of being in the study, and participating in the interviews, and how some of them were like, no one's ever asked me these questions before, these kinds of questions before, and so I think it sounded like a lot of folks just had never thought about any of this stuff.
yeah, which was again really meaningful,
Mm.
that I didn't expect, because this
Yeah.
was something I'm like, well, of course people examine themselves, but I'm in
Mhm.
counseling, so we like all of that work that I did was in
Yeah.
higher ed, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so that was something that was really a surprise and really meaningful, and going into that study, I really wanted to ensure, reciprocity wise, it's always difficult because you're confined by IRB, right? Review board regulations. Like I can only give so much in terms financially backed, for participating in the study.
Hmm.
At the time with it being a dissertation, I couldn't have like co-authors. So I'm like, what does that
Hmm.
look like? But how do I do service to their stories, right?
Hmm.
And in the analysis, how do I do right by them as well? And so the dissertation is long because my appendix, I think, is longer than my actual 3 chapters, because the appendix, I had asked them back. I gave them the summaries from their interviews. They had 3 interviews that were each an hour and a half long. And
Yep.
I said, can you tell me what I'm missing? And they wrote all of them, I think, except for maybe 1 or 2, the majority of them, like 6, had wrote back responses. And they had corrected me in many ways, right? Like,
Mm.
no, you've missed this fact, or this was incorrect.
Mm.
And I normally, as a researcher, you don't show that, right? You kind of don't show that feedback. You're just like, I
Hmm.
integrated the feedback of the participant.
Yeah.
But I actually wanted to share that, because I'm like, you need to
Love
see
that.
this, right? You need to see the exchange happening, and then how I'm moving forward or interpreting that.
Mm.
And so in the dissertation, not in the published paper, because it would be too long, but in the dissertation and the
Mm.
appendix, I have those summaries and their responses, um, as a way, again, of kind of, not so much reciprocity, but holding that their knowledge is sacred. Like, this is something I acknowledge.
Mm.
I don't want to, in my Western non-Indigenous, perspective, I know that how I'm interpreting it isn't going to be fully aligned with what you're sharing. And so how do I best show that, right? How do I best
Yeah.
share that? Um, and that's actually something that Courtney and I have been talking about with her study, and in terms of ways to interview, and to hold that space, so those stories can unfold and those surprises will come up, and then what do you do with that knowledge, right? How do you
Mm.
interpret it, and then share it out with the world, because it extends beyond just into just people's, right?
Yeah.
Reciprocity and knowledge is sacred. It extends into every community, but we just don't
Yeah.
know how to operationalize that.
Mm. So Courtney, did this sort of the themes that you could describe in this study, did that resonate for you? Was your experience? Did you have experience similar to this, where by the time you got into university, sort of things turned around, but the road there was a little
Kind
troublesome?
of, sort of.
Yeah.
And so mine was more so after, because I purposefully went to a historically Black university, because that is what I felt that's what I needed at the time. And
Yeah.
that is how I wanted to connect culturally at that time. But then with gaining that and having the experience of being at that university, I was like, okay, I'm ready now. I'm equipped
Mm.
enough. I feel like I can handle walking, like Dr. Katy said, walking in both worlds. I can handle that now. And so with the armor, with everything that I gained
Mm.
and I learned and that I earned in being at HBCU, I was able to then, okay, well, let me connect with the Native community here in Greensboro, in Guilford County. What does that look like? What are the things that are going on here? Where do I fit in that regard? And so learning more about their culture and their community, because most of the community there identifies as Lumbee. And so learning more about their history and their practices and how they move through processing things I said, yes, it's important for me to get back connected, but it's also important for me to get back connected with my community as well. And
Mm,
so then started doing a lot of trying to connect with things back home, still while I was still in North Carolina, but
mm,
trying to get connected with there were our language department was growing very rapidly.
mm,
So trying to see how I could get resources on learning language. Where are the things that I can learn? What are the things I can, because I had that foundational base from going to culture classes and being a part of things as a child. I had that
mm,
foundational basis for me to grow upon from there. And so
mm,
then
mm,
I wanted to continue to grow that. And then with coming back, just jumping right in. And so being a part of being involved in the community center, making sure that I'm always tapping in with whatever that it is that they have going on at that certain time, being going to powwows, going to socials, learning dances, making sure that I'm working with the youth that they have at their summer camp, so that they have those same foundations, they have those same role models and individuals to look up forward to, and are getting nuggets along the way, and as
mm,
well as participating in our government process. In addition, going to tribal council meetings and making sure that I'm involved and that my voice is heard and the needs of the community that I represent are being heard. And so,
mm,
as someone who is mixed, especially being mixed Black and Native, making sure that our
mm,
concerns are being heard in those tribal council meetings as well, making sure that we are being advocated for and the things that are specific to us. And then also having the perspective of being enrolled Seneca and being out of state. And so when we're making decisions, how does that look for our family members who aren't tied to the land in the same way that
right.
the rest of the community is? And so making sure that all people are represented in
Mm,
our community is very, very important to me, because I
mm,
have the experience of feeling not represented in the community.
mhm,
And
yeah.
so it all came back. And then once I saw that my involvement could create change,
The third secret word is buffalo.
I got more involved.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Katie, you mentioned the piece about sort of, this study was around, I mean, the one piece about when they get into sort of university, and universities tend to be a place where, um, you know, once folks are finally free of sort of the 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 constraints of high school, and the stress and the bullying and or whatever burnout of high school, they get into sort of university setting potentially where there are these student associations and these groups that come together, and sort of student unions and whatnot that sort of can bring sort of folks different cultures together. um I have a hunch that this process probably wouldn't work out as well for folks that didn't go to university, because to not have sort of a place where they can start re-exploring and reconnecting. And so do you have thoughts on that? Like, is this a higher education piece that's making this work, or?
I think in some ways, yes, because like you said, that's where, I mean, I think for a lot of us, right? Like that's where we find ourselves, right? Because we're kind of free from,
Yeah.
depending on where we go. We may be immersed in a completely different
Yeah.
culture, and in some ways it could be good. In some ways it could maybe not to be
Mm,
so good. So for me, I went. College was my first experience of really
mm,
racism. Overt
right.
racism.
That
Because it
too.
was
Yeah.
predominantly white school. I was one of only
Sure.
like a handful of students of color, which was really rare, especially for
Mm,
a
mm-hmm,
university. And so
mm-hmm.
it was different for me. But to your point, I think that yes, I think it would be different for folks who end up not going into
Yeah.
higher ed. And it's going to vary as well, depending on if they had access to, Title VI programs. And
Mm-hmm.
so, there's a school here within Buffalo Public Schools that is considered the native school. I think people get confused thinking that's where all of the native kids in Buffalo go to, or it's exclusively native kids, and that's not the case.
It's a
But
magnet.
it's a magnet school. They do have the supports there, but the supports also can extend to other schools.
Mm,
And so, do they have access to language classes? The Seneca Nation is privileged in that it is financially pretty strong compared
mm,
to other nations. And so they have been able to hire folks hire folks within the nation who have been able to go and to get a degree even in language revitalization or indigenous histories and context, and they're teaching, right? They're going to the schools, offering academic supports, offering language immersion, mostly at the elementary level. I think, did they do middle as well, Courtney? Or is it
I
mostly
know that
elementary?
the tutoring is also open and available for after school in middle school still. I don't know if they're pushing in as much at that level or if it's just outside of school, but I'm also not sure of what NACS offers compared to just what is provided from the nation and the Buffalo Public Schools.
Right. So so once elementary, you get all the supports, and then as you go up, which is usually when it's most critical in terms of your identity development, as you get to middle school and high school, you don't have as much access. And so, your access is going to be important. Do you live on the res? Do you not? So that's where, for me, being a school counselor, becomes really important, because if our school counselors have an understanding of that development, right, some understanding that takes place, or some understanding that there are programs available to continue that growth and that support. But it may be, going to the community center and saying, hey, like, I have a student here who could really benefit from those supports. School counselors can connect with folks in higher ed. So even though higher ed mostly works with college students that are enrolled, there are a lot of folks within student affairs who work at the high school level. They're actively recruiting. And so they have programs, they have summer camps, they have, bridge programs that you can connect students to at the high school, starting at the high school level. And they may not end up in college. Like, that's not a pressure. The hope from those institutions and those programs is that they matriculate into those colleges. But that's not, they don't have to. And so there are ways that school counselors can find those supports and services to really help in mitigating some of those negative factors, right, when it comes to identity development, that really impact Native students and students of color in general.
And just to add from that, from like experience, especially with kind of witnessing my own grandmother's, her being born on a reservation, growing up there through until she was about a teenager, and then coming to the city of Buffalo, and then living out the rest of her life just in Buffalo. So she's a city woman, but she has kind of had her own return to culture, and that has been just because we have had a more consistent base for with our community center. So them having consistent beading classes, them having consistent ribbon shirt making opportunities, her being able to volunteer with the kids at the summer camp and do all of those different things. The more that her just having more knowledge of the things that exist, why we say why it's so important for counselors and helping professionals to be aware of the resources that exist out there, is that you can help facilitate that return, whatever that looks like. And this isn't the only community that kind of has that, where they bring you up in the foundation. We see that with religion as well. You get brought up in the foundation as a youth, you go out, you experience the world, you do your own thing, and then you return as you age. That's something that happens. And so I akin it to that in that way, is that once you have got that out and you have it's something that builds up inside you, where you feel the urge, you feel the pull to return, whatever it is that you have to contribute to the community when it's needed of you. That's when you make your return. And so with higher ed, you're getting all of this knowledge, you're getting all of this practical skill that you are supposed to use as soon as you graduate. So that pull needs to happen earlier so that you can contribute. And so for some individuals, if maybe you just out whooping it up, and so that pull comes later in life, because now you had to bring life experience. You had to go out and live and learn, so that is what you give to the generations going forward. And so the pull might need to happen for you later on than it does for some that had to go to university to learn the book knowledge to give that back. And so I think it happens for different people at different times. I think that the university is a unique setting, though, because it fosters and it allows it to happen a lot more early. And you're being asked in those questions more and more. You're being more self-reflective. You're considering things like identity. Who am I developing? What kind of person do I want going forward once I leave this I've already left my comfort zone of home to come here, and then now I'm going to be building another life after this. So you're being reflective in a much more different way that doesn't come until later on, which is why that pull happens for most individuals later who don't go to university. And so it can be frustrating for the individuals who have the pull early, because you're looking around like, well,
Yeah.
wait, where is everyone else? Different people come at different times. And I think that it offers, I think being in higher education offers the breeding ground for it to happen for you a lot earlier. For some people, it just happens.
Yeah. Wow. Right on. So, so this paper you two are writing, which will be a good resource for folks, is this? Are you still working on it, or is it?
It's going to be, so it's in press. I believe this. So it's in Counseling and Values, which is under the Association of Spirituality, Ethics, Religious Counseling, ACERVIC.
Awesome.
But the journal's called Counseling and Values. And I believe they have 2 issues. I believe the first issue comes out in June. So it's in press, but it won't be coming out until around that time. So we got some time, unfortunately. But yeah, I just lost my place. Yeah, so
it's coming.
It's coming. It's on its way.
Yeah.
I did do an interview with Sage Publications last year when I presented at ACA. When we presented at ACA, they had given me a call and they wanted to do an interview about kind of what we were talking about, these recommendations for the profession. And so I know that should be coming out, I think, shortly. I got to get with them to see exactly when it's coming out. But that should be coming out this spring sometime as well. But we're both members of the Society of Indian Psychologists, which is through APA, and they're a wonderful organization. And highly recommend anybody who is wanting to work with Indigenous communities, connect with SIP. You don't have to be identified as a psychologist. You don't have to identify as a counselor. We have social workers that are part of that organization. But they are fantastic. And
helping professional graduate students as well. Joining that organization as well. There's a lot of supports and mentorship that's available through that organization.
Well, and I heard their last conference or whatever, there was like something like 450 people there, and half of them were students. So it sounds like it's a big push. So
we had a really good turnout with students over the summer. And APA was out. The exec board of APA was out because they did a formal apology and citation.
That's
so they're doing a lot of work. APA is attempting to do some of that reconciliation work. American Counseling Association, ACA, where Courtney and I are trying to prod them to do similar work. And that associations like competition. So if APA is doing it, they got to get their hat in the ring here sometime. So genuinely, though, hopefully more genuine than just for the recognition. So.
Well, it's awesome. I love the work you guys are doing. Katy and Courtney, thanks for coming on the podcast. This was really cool. I learned a whole lot. It was so awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, right on. I could do that again.